Did you know that one moment of arrogance can destroy a career built over decades? Officer Derek Holloway was about to learn that lesson in the most humiliating way possible. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble lobby of Meridian Technologies, one of the largest tech corporations in the Pacific Northwest. The building stood like a glass monument to innovation, its sleek exterior reflecting the Seattle skyline in fractured geometric patterns. Inside, the air conditioning hummed with mechanical precision, and the faint scent of expensive coffee lingered near the reception area. It was the kind of place where billion-dollar decisions were made before lunch, where power moved invisibly through corridors lined with abstract art worth more than most people's homes. This was a temple of success, of arrival, of achievement. And on this particular Thursday, it would become the stage for a collision that would ripple through social media, news networks, and water-cooler conversations across the entire country. Officer Derek Holloway stepped through the revolving doors with the confident swagger of a man who believed his uniform granted him authority everywhere he went. 22 years on the force, 51 years old, a thick neck that strained against his collar, eyes that had learned to see the world in categories, in assumptions, in predetermined conclusions. He'd been called to Meridian Technologies for what dispatch described as a welfare check and possible trespassing situation. Some concerned employee had apparently reported a suspicious person lingering near the executive floors. Derek had taken the call without hesitation. He always did. These corporate buildings with their fancy lobbies and their carefully curated diversity photos on the walls, they were all the same to him. They hired people who looked good in brochures, but kept their real power in familiar hands. He'd seen it 1,000 times. The security guard at the front desk, a young Hispanic man named Carlos, looked up nervously as Derek approached. "Officer, I think there might be some confusion here. The person who was reported, she actually works." "I'll determine what's what," Derek interrupted, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio. "Where's the individual in question?" Carlos hesitated, his eyes darting toward the elevator bank. "Sir, I really think you should speak with building management first. This is..." "Son, I don't need a tour guide. Where?" "Executive level, 23rd floor, but officer, please, I need to call upstairs first." Derek was already walking toward the elevators, his boots clicking against the polished floor with rhythmic authority. He pressed the button and waited, watching his reflection in the stainless steel doors. He looked good, authoritative, in control. Exactly what he'd always imagined when he first put on the uniform all those years ago. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and he stepped inside, pressing the button for the 23rd floor. As the elevator rose, he ran through the scenario in his mind. Probably some lost delivery person. Maybe someone dressed too casually who'd wandered into the wrong area. He'd done this routine 100 times, ask some questions, establish authority, escort them out. Simple, clean, over in 10 minutes. The elevator opened into a reception area that screamed wealth and power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Puget Sound. The furniture looked like it belonged in a modern art museum. Everything was white, chrome, and glass. A woman sat behind a curved desk made of what appeared to be polished obsidian, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to visible concern as Derek stepped off the elevator. "Officer, how can I help you?" Her voice was carefully controlled, but her fingers had already moved toward her phone. "Got a call about someone who doesn't belong up here. Trespassing situation. I need to speak with whoever's in charge of this floor." "Sir, I assure you there's been a misunderstanding. Everyone on this floor is..." "Ma'am, I'm not asking for a debate. I'm asking for cooperation." Derek's voice had taken on that edge he'd perfected over 2 decades. That tone that made people comply without understanding why. The receptionist's jaw tightened. She pressed a button on her phone, speaking quietly into her headset. Derek couldn't make out the words, but he caught the urgency in her tone. "Good. Let them know he was here. Let them know he wasn't playing games. He walked past her desk, ignoring her protests, moving down a corridor lined with glass-walled offices. The people inside looked up from their computers, their conversations stopping mid-sentence. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense the change in atmosphere. His presence had altered something fundamental about this space. And then he saw her. She stood in a corner office at the end of the hallway, her back to the door, speaking on a phone while looking out at the Seattle skyline. She was a black woman, late 30s, wearing jeans and a casual blazer over a simple black t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, no makeup that Derek could see from this distance. She looked, to his experienced eye, exactly like someone who had wandered into the wrong building, maybe confused about where she was supposed to be. The office around her was immaculate, modern, powerful, but she seemed too casual for this environment, too comfortable in her informality. It didn't add up. People who belonged in offices like this wore suits. They carried themselves with a certain pretension. This woman looked like she'd just walked in from a coffee shop. Derek pushed open the glass door without knocking. The woman turned, her phone still pressed to her ear. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, Derek saw something in them that should have given him pause. Not fear, not confusion, something else. Something like recognition, like she knew exactly how this was about to unfold. "I'm going to have to call you back," she said into the phone, her voice calm, measured, almost musical in its control. She ended the call and slipped the phone into her pocket. "Can I help you, officer? I'm going to need to see some identification. We've had reports of unauthorized individuals on this floor." The woman's expression didn't change. "I see. And you are?" "Officer Derek Holloway, Seattle PD. Your name?" "Before we continue this conversation, officer, I'd like to understand exactly what prompted this visit. Who reported an unauthorized individual?" Derek felt his irritation rising. This was the part he hated. When people asked questions instead of answering them. When they thought they could negotiate with authority. "Ma'am, I'm not here to explain myself to you. I'm here to verify your identity and your authorization to be in this location. Now, are you going to cooperate, or do we need to make this more complicated than it needs to be?" The woman crossed her arms, leaning back slightly against her desk. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, the sun was beginning its descent toward the Olympic Mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The light caught her face at an angle that made her expression unreadable, almost silhouetted against the brightness. "My name," she said slowly, "is Naomi Kendrick." The name meant nothing to Derek. Should it have? He pulled out his notepad, writing it down with deliberate slowness. "And what brings you to this floor, Ms. Kendrick?" "I work here." "In what capacity?" "That's an interesting question, officer." Her voice had taken on a different quality now. Colder, more precise, like steel wrapped in silk. "Tell me, when you received this call, did anyone provide you with a description of the supposed trespasser?" Derek's hand moved unconsciously toward his belt. "Ma'am, I'm asking the questions here." "Of course you are." Naomi pushed off from the desk, taking a single step forward. She was shorter than Derek, maybe 5'6" in her casual sneakers, but something about the way she moved made the space feel smaller, made the power dynamics shift in ways Derek couldn't quite identify. "But before this goes any further, I need you to understand something. You've made a mistake, a significant one. And what happens in the next 60 seconds will determine whether that mistake becomes a minor embarrassment or a career-defining disaster." Derek's face flushed. 22 years. 22 years he'd been doing this job, and now some woman in jeans was threatening him. In this moment, something inside Derek Holloway snapped. All the frustration of a changing world, all the resentment he carried like armor, all the anger at a society that no longer seemed to respect what his uniform represented, it crystallized into a single, catastrophic decision. His hand shot out, and the sound of the slap echoed through the glass-walled office like a gunshot. The silence that followed was more deafening than the slap itself. Naomi's head had snapped to the side, her hand instinctively rising to her cheek where Derek's palm had connected with enough force to leave an immediate red imprint. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The world seemed to have stopped spinning on its axis. Through the glass walls of the office, a dozen employees stood frozen at their desks, their faces masks of absolute horror. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others had already pulled out their phones, recording, documenting, preserving this moment in digital amber for eternity. Derek's hand was still suspended in the air, trembling slightly, as if his body was only now informing his brain of what it had just done. His breathing had become ragged, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to catalogue. Shock, defiance, fear, anger, justification. The internal monologue of a man who had crossed a line and was now desperately trying to convince himself he'd had no choice, that she had provoked this, that somehow the narrative could still be shaped in his favor. Naomi slowly lowered her hand from her face and turned back to look at him. Her eyes were different now. The calm, measured quality had been replaced by something far more dangerous. Not rage, exactly. Something colder, more calculated. The look of a person who had just been handed an unexpected gift, wrapped in violence and tied with the rope that would hang her opponent. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet, it barely traveled the distance between them, yet it carried the weight of an earthquake. "You just assaulted me in my own office." Derek's mouth opened, then closed. Words formed and died on his tongue. The uniform that had always protected him, that had always been his shield and his sword, suddenly felt like it was made of paper. "You were being non-compliant. You were threatening an officer." "You felt nothing," Naomi interrupted, and now she did take another step forward, closing the distance until she was close enough that Derek could see the moisture gathering at the corner of her eye. Not from pain, from something else entirely. "You didn't feel threatened by a woman 40 pounds lighter than you, standing in an office with glass walls, surrounded by witnesses. You felt disrespected. You felt challenged. You felt like someone who looked like me had the audacity to question someone who looked like you. That's not... I don't..." Derek's words stumbled over themselves like drunken soldiers. His hand had finally dropped to his side, but it was shaking now, the tremor visible even from a distance. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Naomi reached into her pocket, moving slowly, deliberately, maintaining eye contact the entire time. She pulled out her phone and held it up, the screen facing Derek. On it was a badge. Not a police badge. Something else. An employee ID, but not just any employee ID. The photo showed Naomi in more formal attire, her expression professional, her smile measured. But it was the text beneath the photo that made Derek's stomach drop into his shoes. Chief Executive Officer, Meridian Technologies. The phone stayed suspended between them, a small rectangular window into Derek's worst nightmare. His eyes darted from the screen to Naomi's face and back again, his brain refusing to process what it was seeing. This couldn't be right. CEOs didn't wear jeans. CEOs didn't work on Thursday afternoons without makeup and security details. CEOs weren't. The thought formed before he could stop it. CEOs weren't supposed to look like her. "I'm going to give you a choice, Officer Holloway." Naomi lowered the phone, sliding it back into her pocket with deliberate slowness. "You can leave this building right now, and you can wait for what happens next to happen. Or you can stay, and you can try to explain to my head of security, my general counsel, and the 36 employees who just watched you assault me, why you thought this was an appropriate response to a welfare check. Derek's training kicked in, that autopilot that every cop develops after years on the force. When in doubt, reassert authority. When cornered, attack. This is, "You're twisting what happened here." I responded to a legitimate call. You were non-compliant. You escalated the situation. Any investigation will show. "Any investigation," Naomi said, her voice cutting through his desperate scrambling like a scalpel, "will show that you assaulted a black woman CEO in her own office, without provocation, without cause, and without any attempt to verify the information you'd been given before barging in here like you owned the place." She paused, letting the words sink in like stones into dark water. "But let me tell you what else an investigation will show, officer. It will show a pattern. Because this isn't the first time, is it?" Derek felt the blood drain from his face. "I don't know what you..." Sarah Mitchell, 2019, excessive force complaint, dismissed by your department. Marcus Thompson, 2020, racial profiling allegations settled quietly. Jennifer Washington, 2021, unnecessary escalation, filed a complaint that somehow never made it past your sergeant's desk. Naomi rattled off the names like she was reading from a grocery list, each one landing like a physical blow. "Should I continue? Because I've got about 15 more minutes of your greatest hits memorized, and we haven't even gotten to the really interesting parts yet." "How do you..." Derek's voice cracked. "You can't. That information is accessible to anyone willing to file the right public records requests and connect the dots your department has been carefully leaving unconnected for the better part of a decade." Naomi walked back to her desk, pressing a button on her phone. "Jennifer, could you please come in here? And bring Mark and Sandra with you." Derek felt the walls closing in. Through the glass, he could see people moving now, no longer frozen in shock, but activated into purpose. A woman in a sharp navy suit was striding toward the office, a tablet tucked under her arm. Behind her, a man with silver hair and a perfectly tailored charcoal suit followed, his expression grim. A third person, a younger woman with auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun, carried what appeared to be a laptop. "Officer Holloway," Naomi said, settling into the chair behind her desk with the casual authority of someone who had sat in that chair 1,000 times before. "Let me tell you how this is going to work. In approximately 90 seconds, you're going to meet Jennifer Walsh, my Chief Operating Officer, Mark Hendricks, my General Counsel, and Sandra Kim, my VP of Human Resources and Corporate Security. They're going to ask you some questions. They're going to inform you that your services are no longer needed on these premises. And then they're going to escort you to the elevator, where Carlos, remember him? The security guard you dismissed downstairs, will make sure you exit the building." The door opened, and the 3 executives entered like a well-rehearsed cavalry charge. Jennifer Walsh moved immediately to Naomi's side, her eyes scanning the red mark still visible on her boss's cheek. "Are you all right?" Her voice was tight with controlled fury. "I'm fine, Jen, but we need to document this immediately." Mark Hendricks was already tapping on his tablet, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Officer Holloway, I'm Mark Hendricks, General Counsel for Meridian Technologies. I need to inform you that as of this moment, you are no longer authorized to be on these premises. Any statements you make can and will be used in the civil proceedings we're about to initiate." Derek felt like he was drowning. "Civil proceedings? You can't..." "I'm a police officer conducting an investigation." "An investigation?" Sandra Kim interrupted, opening her laptop and turning it to face him. "That we have fully recorded from 6 different angles, including the security cameras in this office, the phones of at least 9 employees, and the camera embedded in Ms. Kendrick's desk lamp. Would you like to see the footage? Because I can assure you it's remarkably clear. The lighting in this office is excellent." On the laptop screen, Derek could see himself, frozen in the moment just before the slap. The angle was perfect, catching every detail of his face, the anger in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. There was no ambiguity here, no room for interpretation, no way to spin this into anything other than what it was. "I want my union rep," Derek managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to." "You're welcome to contact anyone you'd like," Mark said smoothly, "from outside this building, which is where you're going to be in approximately 3 minutes. Naomi stood again, moving around the desk until she was facing Derek directly. The light from the window had shifted, and now her face was fully visible, every emotion playing across her features like a symphony. Pain, yes, but also disappointment, sadness, and something that looked almost like pity. "Officer Holloway, do you know how many times I've been asked to prove I belong in spaces where I've earned my place? Do you know how many times people like you have looked at me and seen a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected?" She paused, searching his face for some sign of understanding, some glimmer of recognition. "I built this company from nothing. I wrote the first lines of code in a studio apartment in Fremont. I pitched to investors who told me to my face that someone like me couldn't lead a tech company. I proved them wrong year after year, success after success, until this building, this monument to innovation you walked into without permission, became reality." Derek wanted to look away but found he couldn't. Something in her voice held him captive, forced him to witness his own failure reflected in her eyes. "And then you walked in here," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, "and within 3 minutes, you reduced all of that achievement, all of that struggle, all of that proof to nothing, because to you, I was just another black woman in the wrong place, needing to be put in her place." She stepped back, creating distance, creating space for him to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. "You had one moment to see me as a human being, officer. One chance to ask a question before making an assumption. One opportunity to look at the nameplate on the door, or the photos on the desk, or even just to listen when people tried to warn you. But you didn't, because you didn't think you needed to. And that is why, in approximately 10 minutes, you're going to be unemployed." "You can't fire me," Derek said. But there was no conviction in his voice anymore, only desperate hope clinging to a technicality. "You're not my employer. The city—" "You're right," Naomi said, moving back to her desk and picking up her phone. "I can't fire you directly, but I can do something much more effective." She pressed a number, waited for a single ring. "Hello, Mayor Richardson?" "Yes, it's Naomi. I'm sorry to disturb you on a Thursday afternoon, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Derek watched, paralyzed, as Naomi Kendrick, the woman he'd just assaulted, the CEO he'd mistaken for a trespasser, the human being he'd reduced to a problem, calmly explained the situation to the mayor of Seattle. Her voice never rose. Her tone never became emotional. She simply stated facts, provided evidence, and made one simple request. "I want him terminated by end of business today," she said into the phone, her eyes locked on Derek's face. "Not suspended, not put on leave, fired. And I want it done publicly, with a statement acknowledging exactly what happened and why. Because this isn't just about me, Mayor Richardson. It's about every person of color who's been treated like they don't belong in spaces they've earned. It's about accountability. It's about sending a message that this stops now." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seattle skyline had transformed into a canvas of deepening purples and burnt oranges as the sun continued its descent. The city below moved on, oblivious to the tectonic shift occurring 23 floors above the street. Cars crawled along the interstate like luminous insects. Ferries crossed the sound with the patience of ancient creatures. Life continued its relentless forward motion, while inside this glass-walled office time had fractured into before and after. Derek Holloway stood motionless as Naomi ended her call with the mayor, the phone returning to her desk with a soft click that sounded to him like a judge's gavel. His mind was racing through scenarios, each one more desperate than the last. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be some angle he hadn't considered, some explanation that would reframe what had happened into something survivable. But every path his thoughts took ended at the same destination. Ruin. "Jennifer will escort you down," Naomi said, her voice returning to that measured, professional tone that somehow made everything worse. The anger would have been easier to bear. Anger was something Derek understood, something he could fight against or deflect. But this clinical efficiency, this business-like dismantling of his entire career, left him with nothing to grab onto, no foothold to stop his fall. Jennifer Walsh stepped forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with metronomic precision. She was a tall woman, maybe 5'10", with the kind of bearing that suggested she'd played basketball in college and still ran marathons for fun. Her navy suit was immaculate, her expression carved from granite. "This way, officer." But Derek couldn't move. His feet had become anchors, welded to the floor by the weight of disbelief. "Wait," he heard himself say, the word emerging strangled and small. "Just wait a second, there has to be... Can't we talk about this?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an interesting specimen. "Talk about what exactly? The assault? The racial profiling? The abuse of authority? Which part would you like to discuss, Officer Holloway?" It wasn't like that. You have to understand, the call I got, it said..." Derek was floundering now, grasping at justifications that disintegrated the moment they left his mouth. "In my experience, when someone's evasive, when they're asking questions instead of answering them, it usually means that they're guilty of something," Naomi finished for him, one eyebrow arching slightly. "Or could it mean that they're tired? Tired of being presumed guilty in spaces they've earned the right to occupy? Tired of being treated as suspicious for existing while black in America?" She leaned back against her desk, crossing her arms in a posture that mirrored how she'd stood just minutes earlier, before everything fell apart. "Tell me something, officer. When was the last time you burst into a corner office and demanded ID from a white person in casual clothes?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Derek opened his mouth, then closed it. Opened it again. Race had nothing to do with this, didn't it?" Mark Hendricks spoke for the first time since the phone call ended, his silver hair catching the fading light from the windows. He moved to stand beside Naomi, his tablet still in hand, his expression that of a man who'd spent 30 years in corporate law and had seen every variation of human failing. "Officer, I've reviewed the call logs from the employee who reported a suspicious person on this floor. Would you like to know what he said, word for word?" Derek said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Mark tapped his tablet, reading from the screen with the careful enunciation of someone presenting evidence to a jury. Quote, "There's someone on the executive floor who doesn't look like they belong here. Black female, casual clothes. I think she might be lost or something." End quote. He looked up, his eyes meeting Derek's with laser precision. "The employee who called it in has been with the company for 6 weeks. He works in IT support. He's never met Ms. Kendrick in person because she was traveling for most of his first month. He saw a black woman dressed casually, and his immediate assumption was that she was lost, confused, possibly trespassing. Not that she might be an executive enjoying a casual Friday. Not that she might belong here. His first instinct was suspicion. That's his problem, not mine," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I responded to the call as reported." "And how did you respond?" Sandra Kim asked, looking up from her laptop where she'd been typing furiously. "Let's walk through it step by step. You arrived in the building. Carlos, our security guard, attempted to explain the situation. You dismissed him. You rode the elevator to this floor. Our receptionist, Michelle, attempted to explain the situation. You dismissed her. You walked down the hallway, past multiple nameplates and office identifications, and entered Ms. Kendrick's office without knocking. At any point during this chain of events, did you stop to verify the information you'd been given? Did you ask to see building management? Did you request the employee directory? Did you even once consider that perhaps everyone trying to stop you knew something you didn't? The words landed like body blows, each one precisely aimed at the crumbling foundation of Derek's justifications. He thought about his training, about the protocols he'd been taught, about the procedures that were supposed to guide situations exactly like this. And he realized, with a sickening clarity, that he'd violated nearly every single one. Not because he didn't know better, but because he'd assumed he didn't need to follow them. Because he'd looked at the situation, at Naomi, and decided that his instinct was more reliable than protocol. "I made a mistake," Derek finally said. The admission scraped raw from somewhere deep in his chest. "Okay, I made a mistake. I should have verified. But the situation escalated and I felt..." "You felt what?" Naomi's voice cut through his fumbling like a knife. She pushed off from the desk, moving toward him again, and Derek instinctively took a step back. The movement was small, reflexive, but everyone in the room saw it. The officer, the man with the gun and the badge and 22 years of authority, backing away from an unarmed woman 8 inches shorter than him. "You felt threatened? You felt disrespected? Help me understand, Officer Holloway. What emotion could possibly justify putting your hands on me?" The question was a trap, and Derek knew it. Any answer he gave would be wrong. But the silence was worse, so he filled it with the only truth he had left. "I don't know. It happened so fast and I wasn't thinking and there it is," Naomi said softly, almost gently. "You weren't thinking. You were feeling. You were operating on instinct, on reflex, on 22 years of learned behavior that taught you certain people get certain treatment. And when someone who looked like me had the audacity to question you, to challenge your authority, to stand in a space you didn't think she belonged, your body responded before your brain could catch up." She was close to him now, close enough that he could see the slight tremor in her hands, despite the steadiness of her voice. "Do you know what that means, officer? It means this isn't about one bad moment. It's about a pattern so deeply ingrained you don't even recognize it anymore. It's muscle memory. It's institutional. It's exactly the problem we've been trying to explain to people like you for generations." Derek felt something crack inside him, some internal wall he'd been maintaining through sheer stubbornness. "So what do you want from me?" The question came out desperate, almost pleading. "You want me to say I'm racist? You want me to... What do you want?" "I want you to understand," Naomi said. And now there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something sadder, something that acknowledged the futility of what she was asking for. "I want you to look at me, really look at me, and see a human being who worked harder than you can possibly imagine to get here. I want you to feel the weight of what you took from me today. Not my dignity, because you can't take that, but my peace, my sense of safety in my own office, my ability to exist in this space I built without wondering if the next person who walks through that door is going to see me as a threat instead of a person." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "I want you to understand that this moment, this collision between us, is happening thousands of times a day across this country. In stores where black women are followed by security, in neighborhoods where black men are questioned for walking their own streets, in schools where black children are disciplined more harshly for the same infractions. And I want you to ask yourself what role you've played in perpetuating that system." The office had gone completely silent. Even the ambient sounds of the building seemed to have faded away, leaving only Naomi's words hanging in the air like a challenge, like a prayer, like a judgment. Derek looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since he'd walked into this office, he saw not a problem or a threat or an inconvenience, but a person. A person with a story, a person with achievements, a person who'd been reduced to a profile, a statistic, a set of assumptions based on nothing more than the color of her skin, and the weight of that recognition nearly buckled his knees. He started, but the words died in his throat. What could he possibly say? What apology could bridge the chasm between what he'd done and what he now understood? "I'm sorry," felt like a band-aid on a bullet wound, meaningless and inadequate. Naomi must have seen something in his face change because her expression softened slightly, losing some of its sharp edges. "I believe you are," she said quietly. "Or at least, I believe you're beginning to be. But here's the thing about consequences, Officer Holloway. They don't care about epiphanies. They don't wait for understanding. They arrive whether you're ready or not." As if summoned by her words, the elevator chimed in the distance. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Through the glass walls, Derek could see them coming. Two uniformed officers, both younger than him, their faces set in grim professional masks. Behind them, a man in a suit he recognized as the police chief's chief of staff. And behind him, walking with the measured pace of someone who'd rather be anywhere else, Captain James Morrison, Derek's direct supervisor. The cavalry had arrived, but not to rescue him. Captain Morrison entered the office, his eyes taking in the scene with the practiced efficiency of a 25-year veteran. He looked at Derek, at Naomi, at the assembled executives, and Derek watched his captain's face cycle through realization, disappointment, and resignation in the span of 3 seconds. "Officer Holloway," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of difficult decisions and sleepless nights to come. "I'm going to need your badge and your weapon." The words landed like stones in still water, their ripples spreading outward to touch everything. Derek's hand moved automatically to his badge, his fingers tracing the metal that had defined his identity for more than 2 decades. This small piece of brass and authority had been his shield, his purpose, his proof of worth. And now it was being taken away, transformed from symbol to artifact in the span of a single afternoon. "Captain, please, if I could just explain." "There's footage, Derek." Morrison's voice wasn't cruel, but it was final. "Multiple angles, clear audio. The mayor's office called me directly, so did the DA. There's no coming back from this." Derek looked at Naomi one last time, and in her eyes he saw not triumph or satisfaction, but something far more complex. She looked tired, worn down, not by this single encounter, but by the accumulation of thousands like it, a lifetime of having to prove she belonged in spaces she'd earned. And Derek realized with devastating clarity that she'd been right. This wasn't about her winning or him losing. This was about a system finally, briefly, holding someone accountable for its failures. She was just the catalyst. He was just the consequence. His hands shook as he unpinned his badge and handed it to Morrison. The weight of his service weapon felt different as he drew it, holding it by the grip with the barrel pointed safely down, passing it over with all the ceremony of a funeral. In that moment, Derek Holloway ceased to be an officer of the law and became simply a man who'd made an irreversible mistake, standing in an office that wasn't his, facing consequences he'd never imagined could touch him. But as the 2 younger officers moved to flank him, ready to escort him from the building, something else happened. Something none of them expected. Naomi's phone, still sitting on her desk, began to ring. The screen lit up with an incoming call, and the name that appeared made everyone in the room freeze. The caller ID read, Officer Sarah Mitchell. The name on Naomi's phone screen seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity, as if it had broken through from another dimension where past and present collided. Sarah Mitchell. The name Derek had heard just minutes earlier when Naomi had rattled off his history like she was reading from a prosecution file. 2019. Excessive force complaint, dismissed by your department. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a name in a file or a statistic in a pattern of behavior. She was a real person, and she was calling right now, at this precise moment, as if summoned by some cosmic sense of timing that defied rational explanation. Naomi stared at the phone, her hand hovering over it but not quite touching it, as if the device had suddenly become something dangerous. The red mark on her cheek had begun to fade slightly, but it was still visible enough to serve as a physical reminder of why they were all standing here, in this tableau of consequence and reckoning. Her finger moved toward the screen, hesitated, then tapped the green icon. She raised the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving Derek's face. "Sarah," she said, her voice carefully modulated, professional but with an undercurrent of something else. Something that suggested this call was not coincidental, that wheels had been set in motion long before today. "Your timing is impeccable." Derek couldn't hear the voice on the other end of the line, but he watched Naomi's expression shift subtly as she listened. Her eyes widened fractionally, then narrowed. She nodded once, twice, even though the person on the phone couldn't see her. "Yes," she said finally. "He's here. Right now, actually. How did you—" "Of course you did. You've been monitoring it." Captain Morrison had gone very still, the kind of stillness that suggested a man trying to piece together a puzzle whose full picture he was only beginning to comprehend. "Who is Sarah Mitchell?" he asked quietly, directing the question to no one in particular. Jennifer Walsh answered, her voice crisp and informative, like she was delivering a briefing to the board. "Sarah Mitchell is a former police officer with the Seattle PD. In 2019, she filed an excessive force complaint against Officer Holloway after he physically restrained her during a domestic dispute call, leaving bruises on her arms and wrists. The complaint was investigated by Internal Affairs and dismissed due to lack of corroborating evidence. 6 months later, Officer Mitchell resigned from the force, citing a hostile work environment and ongoing harassment from fellow officers who viewed her complaint as betrayal. Derek felt the blood drain from his face for the second time in less than an hour. The Sarah Mitchell incident had been buried so deep in his memory that he'd almost convinced himself it hadn't happened the way she'd claimed. She'd been a rookie, too emotional, too sensitive for the job. She'd misunderstood the situation, mischaracterized his actions. That's what he'd told himself. That's what the investigation had concluded. That's what had allowed him to move forward without the weight of that moment dragging behind him. But now, hearing her name spoken aloud in this context, in this office, by these people who had already dismantled every defense he'd constructed, Derek felt the foundations of his self-perception crack even further. How many Sarah Mitchells had there been? How many Marcus Thompsons and Jennifer Washingtons? How many moments where he'd been so certain of his righteousness that he'd never stopped to question whether certainty itself might be the problem? Naomi lowered the phone slightly, covering the microphone with her palm. She looked at Derek with an expression that contained layers upon layers of meaning. "Sarah Mitchell has been tracking your career for 6 years. She said, her voice steady but charged with significance. After she left the force, she became a private investigator specializing in police misconduct cases. She's the one who compiled the file on you, the one who connected all the dots your department kept carefully separated." Naomi paused, letting that information settle over the room like fallout. "She's also the one who called me 3 months ago and told me you were someone I should be aware of. That eventually our paths would cross. That when they did, I should be ready." The implications of this revelation rippled outward through Derek's consciousness like shockwaves. 3 months ago. Naomi had known about him for 3 months, which meant today wasn't just a random collision of circumstance. It wasn't just bad luck or poor judgment. It was the inevitable conclusion of a pattern that had been documented, analyzed, and anticipated. Sarah Mitchell had seen something in his behavior 6 years ago that had set her on a path to ensure that one day, somehow, he would face consequences for actions that had been excused, dismissed, and buried by a system designed to protect its own. Why? Derek heard himself ask, the question barely more than a whisper. Why would she? Because she knew the system wouldn't stop you, Naomi said simply, her hand still covering the phone's microphone. Because she understood that without external pressure, without documentation and witnesses and people willing to use their power to demand accountability, officers like you continue doing what you do until you retire with a pension and a plaque. Because she wanted to make sure that when you finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, there would be someone ready to ensure it mattered. Naomi removed her hand from the microphone and raised the phone back to her ear. Sarah, I'm going to put you on speaker. There are some people here who need to hear what you have to say. She tapped the screen, and suddenly a woman's voice filled the office, clear and strong and carrying the kind of conviction that comes from years of contained fury finally finding its outlet. Officer Holloway, this is Sarah Mitchell. I'm sure you remember me, though you probably convinced yourself that what happened between us was justified or exaggerated or somehow my fault. The voice was calm but edged with steel, each word precisely placed. I want you to know that every day since I left the force, I've been building a case against you. Not legally. Statute of limitations ran out on most of your incidents, but ethically, morally, historically. I've interviewed 12 people you've encountered during your career, 12 people who filed complaints that went nowhere, who tried to hold you accountable and were told they were wrong, that they were lying, that they deserved what they got. Derek tried to speak, to interrupt, to defend himself, but his throat had closed up completely. He could only stand there, listening to his past enumerate his failures through a speakerphone in an office where he'd never belonged. Some of those people are black, Sarah continued. Some are white, some are Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern. What they all have in common is that they challenged you, and you responded with force. Not always physical. Sometimes it was intimidation, sometimes it was threats, sometimes it was just the weight of your authority pressing down on them until they broke. But always, there was a pattern. You abuse people who question you. You escalate situations that could be resolved peacefully. And you hide behind your badge like it's a license to treat human beings as obstacles instead of people. Captain Morrison had pulled out his own phone and was typing rapidly, his face a mask of professional composure that barely concealed the storm brewing beneath. The two younger officers stood at attention, their expressions revealing nothing, but Derek could see the way they'd shifted their weight, creating more distance between themselves and him. The universal body language of people who'd realized they were standing next to something contaminated. Ms. Kendrick, Sarah's voice continued, I told you 3 months ago that Derek Holloway was a ticking time bomb, that his pattern was accelerating, that his incidents were becoming more frequent, more aggressive. I told you that if he ever showed up in your vicinity, you should treat him as the threat he is. I'm sorry I couldn't prevent what happened today, but I'm grateful you were prepared. I'm grateful you're in a position to do what I couldn't do 6 years ago. Naomi's eyes glistened slightly, though whether from emotion or simple exhaustion, Derek couldn't tell. You saved me today, Sarah. Your warning, your documentation, it's the only reason I knew to start recording the moment he walked into my office. It's the only reason I was ready to act immediately instead of being paralyzed by shock. How long have you been recording? Captain Morrison asked suddenly, his voice sharp with the realization that this situation was far more orchestrated than he'd initially understood. Naomi's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Since the moment I saw him get off the elevator. My office is equipped with multiple recording systems, all perfectly legal under Washington State's 2-party consent laws, with clear signage posted at every entrance to the executive floor. Officer Holloway walked past 3 such signs on his way here. The cameras are motion-activated, voice-activated, and manually controlled. When Michelle at reception told me a police officer was heading my way without having scheduled an appointment or spoken with building security, I activated every system we have. Derek remembered now, with the crystal clarity of hindsight, seeing those small placards near the elevator. Audio and video recording in use, they'd said, or something similar. He'd dismissed them, assumed they were standard corporate security measures that didn't apply to law enforcement. Another assumption, another mistake, another brick in the edifice of his own destruction. "How many people have seen the footage?" Morrison asked, and Derek detected a note of resignation in his captain's voice, as if he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Sandra Kim answered this time, her fingers still dancing across her laptop keyboard. The initial incident was witnessed live by 14 employees. The footage has been uploaded to our secure servers, copied to 3 separate backup locations, and shared with our legal team. Additionally, as per Ms. Kendrick's standing instructions regarding any security incidents on the executive floor, copies were automatically sent to our insurance company, our board of directors, and our PR firm. As of, she glanced at her screen, 7 minutes ago, our general counsel also forwarded the footage to the mayor's office and the district attorney. Morrison closed his eyes briefly, a gesture of a man watching a career implode in real time. Not his own, but one he'd supervised, one he'd perhaps unknowingly protected through insufficient oversight. Jesus Christ, Derek, what were you thinking? But Derek had no answer. He'd stopped thinking minutes ago, perhaps hours ago, perhaps years ago, when he'd first learned that his badge could be used as a weapon more effective than anything on his belt. When he'd discovered that certain people would always believe him over others, that certain complaints would always be dismissed, that certain patterns would always be excused. The thinking had stopped long before today. Today was just the moment when the consequences finally caught up with the actions. Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the heavy silence that had settled over the office. "Captain Morrison, I've been trying to get someone in the department to take Derek Holloway seriously for 6 years. I filed reports. I sent emails. I even tried going to the media, but without dramatic footage or a victim willing to go public, no one wanted to touch it. Criticizing police officers is bad for ratings, bad for politics, bad for business. Everyone knew there was a problem, but no one wanted to be the one to solve it." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Officer Mitchell, I understand your frustration, but there are procedures that failed," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising slightly for the first time. "Procedures that are designed to protect officers first and seek truth second. Procedures that treat complaints as PR problems instead of ethical crises. How many procedures protected the 12 people I interviewed? How many procedures protected Ms. Kendrick today?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, unanswerable because everyone in the room knew the answer was 0. Naomi was watching Derek with an intensity that made him want to disappear, to unspool from existence, to return to this morning when he was still Officer Derek Holloway, 22-year veteran, respected member of the force, a man with a pension waiting and grandchildren who thought he was a hero. That version of himself felt like it belonged to a different person, someone who'd existed in a different timeline that had just been erased. "Officer Holloway," Naomi said softly, and the gentle tone was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Do you understand now? Do you see why this moment matters beyond just you and me? Sarah spent 6 years of her life documenting your pattern because she believed that eventually you would hurt someone with the power to fight back. She was preparing for this day. She was creating a paper trail that couldn't be buried. She was ensuring that when you finally face consequences, they would be real, and they would be public, and they would matter." Derek's voice came out hoarse, fractured. "I never meant to. I didn't set out to hurt anyone. I was just doing my job." "Were you?" The question came from Jennifer Walsh, who'd been silent for several minutes, her presence a quiet fury in the background. When you slapped Ms. Kendrick, were you doing your job, or were you doing something else? Something that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with power and control and the deeply ingrained belief that certain people need to be put in their place? Derek had no answer. The truth was a chasm he couldn't cross with words. The phone speaker crackled slightly as Sarah Mitchell spoke again, her voice softer now but no less intense. "Naomi, I want you to know something. What happened to you today? It's terrible, and I'm sorry you had to experience it. But it's also the thing I've been working toward for 6 years. Because you're not like the others. You have resources, you have visibility, you have power. When you fight back, people will pay attention in ways they never did for me or Marcus or Jennifer or any of the others. You can make this mean something." Naomi nodded slowly, though Sarah couldn't see her. "I intend to." And in those 3 words, Derek heard the sound of everything that came next. The press conferences, the investigations, the lawsuit that would probably bankrupt him even if the criminal charges didn't stick. The headlines that would follow him forever. The Google searches that would always link his name to assault and excessive force and fired. The conversations his grandchildren would have with their friends who'd seen the footage online. The way his wife would look at him across the dinner table when the settlement was announced. But more than that, Derek heard something else in Naomi's voice. A determination that went beyond personal grievance. A commitment to transform her pain into purpose. To use this moment as a catalyst for something larger than individual justice. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that he wasn't just losing his job. He was becoming a symbol, a cautionary tale, the face of a problem that society had been trying to ignore for generations. Captain Morrison stepped forward, his hand extended toward Derek in a gesture that managed to be both compassionate and final. "It's time to go, Derek." But before Derek could move, before the moment could complete itself, Naomi raised her hand. "Wait, there's one more thing." She tapped her phone screen, ending the call with Sarah Mitchell, and then turned to her computer. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, and after a few seconds, she turned the monitor so everyone could see it. On the screen was a video player, paused on a frame that showed Derek from behind, standing in the hallway outside Naomi's office. The timestamp read 3:17 p.m., several minutes before he'd entered the office. "Before you leave," Naomi said, her hand hovering over the play button, "I want to show you something that's been bothering me since you walked in here." She pressed play, and the footage began to move. The video played in silence that felt heavier than sound. On the monitor, Derek Holloway stood in the hallway outside Naomi's office, his back to the camera, his posture radiating authority and purpose. But something about the image made everyone lean forward slightly, made them watch with an intensity that suggested they were about to witness something significant, something that would recontextualize everything that had already happened. Derek watched himself on the screen, saw his own shoulders rise and fall with breath, saw the way his hand rested on his belt near his radio. And then, on the footage, he saw something he'd forgotten. Something his conscious mind had dismissed as irrelevant in the moment, but that now blazed with terrible significance. Just before entering Naomi's office, the Derek on the screen paused. He turned his head slightly to the left, toward a glass wall displaying a series of framed photographs. The camera angle shifted automatically, zooming in with algorithmic precision to show what he was looking at. The images were professional corporate headshots and candid office photos, the kind of thing every company displays to humanize their leadership team. And there, in the center frame, larger than the others, was a photograph of Naomi Kendrick. Below it, in elegant lettering, a plaque read, "Naomi Kendrick, Chief Executive Officer and Founder." The timestamp showed Derek had stood there for 7 seconds, looking directly at the photograph and the identification. 7 seconds of clear, unobstructed viewing. 7 seconds where the truth was available to him if he'd chosen to see it. And then, in the footage, Derek shook his head slightly, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible, and turned away from the wall. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his belt, and pushed open the door to Naomi's office, with the confidence of a man who'd already decided what he was going to find inside. Naomi paused the video on the frame showing Derek looking at her photograph. The silence in the office was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the building seemed to have been sucked away, leaving only the weight of this revelation hanging in the air like a verdict. "You saw me," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying more power than if she'd shouted. "You saw my photograph. You saw my title. You saw the evidence that I belonged here, that this was my office, that I had every right to be in this space. And you looked away." Derek felt something inside him crack completely, like ice fracturing under pressure. He had no memory of seeing that photograph. Or rather, he had a memory of seeing it, but his brain had filed it away as irrelevant, as information that didn't fit the narrative he'd already constructed. He'd seen a black woman in casual clothes and decided she was a problem before he ever entered the office. And when confronted with evidence that contradicted his assumption, his mind had simply dismissed it, rejected it as incompatible with what he already believed to be true. "I don't," Derek started, but Naomi raised her hand, cutting him off with a gesture. "You don't remember," she finished for him. "I know. That's what makes this so much worse. Your bias was so ingrained, so automatic, that evidence contradicting it didn't even register as important enough to retain. You saw what you expected to see, and everything else became invisible." She stood up from her desk, moving around it with slow, deliberate steps. "Do you know what that means, Officer Holloway? It means that every interaction you've had for 22 years has been filtered through this same lens. Every traffic stop, every welfare check, every complaint. You've been seeing what you expect to see and dismissing everything that contradicts it." Captain Morrison had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the frozen image of Derek looking at Naomi's photograph. "Jesus Christ, Derek," he said again, but this time the words carried a different weight. Not just disappointment or frustration, but something deeper. A recognition that this wasn't a single mistake, or a bad day, or a misunderstanding. This was a fundamental flaw in perception, a cognitive blind spot so profound that it had shaped every professional decision Derek had made for more than 2 decades. Jennifer Walsh stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She moved to stand beside Naomi, a gesture of solidarity and support. "This is the part that people don't understand," she said, her voice steady and instructional, as if she were explaining something to a classroom. "They think racism is about burning crosses and slurs and obvious hatred. But this," she gestured toward the frozen image on the screen, "this is what it actually looks like most of the time. It's the failure to see evidence that contradicts your assumptions. It's the refusal to update your beliefs when confronted with new information. It's the way your brain protects your worldview by making contrary facts invisible." Sarah Mitchell's voice suddenly emerged from Naomi's phone, which was still on the desk. The call hadn't been disconnected after all. She'd been listening to everything, bearing witness from wherever she was. 7 seconds, she said, and her voice carried a note of vindication mixed with sorrow. That's all it would have taken. 7 seconds of genuine attention, of intellectual honesty, of basic professional thoroughness. But you couldn't give her those 7 seconds, could you, Derek? Because giving them to her would have required admitting that your first instinct was wrong. Derek wanted to argue, to explain that it wasn't that simple, that human perception was complicated, that in the moment everything had seemed different. But even as these defenses formed in his mind, He recognized them for what they were: more dismissals, more refusals to see what was directly in front of him. The evidence was irrefutable. The video didn't lie. He had seen Naomi's photograph and her title, and some part of his brain had decided that information was less reliable than his own prejudices. How many times, Derek heard himself ask, the question emerging raw and unfiltered. How many times have I done this? How many people have I hurt because I saw what I expected instead of what was real? Naomi studied him for a long moment, and Derek saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness. It was far too soon, and the harm far too fresh for that. But perhaps a recognition that he was finally, genuinely beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. Not just today, but across years of accumulated moments where his blind spots had real consequences for real people. I don't know, she answered honestly. But Sarah's documentation suggests at least 18 incidents over 6 years where your actions were questioned, complained about, or resulted in formal complaints. That's just what's documented. How many more times did you make someone feel unsafe, threatened, or violated without it ever being reported? She paused, letting the question resonate. How many times did someone look at your badge and uniform and decide that speaking up would only make things worse? The number expanded in Derek's mind like a dark stain, spreading backward through his career, touching moments he'd forgotten or reframed or justified. The young man in Rainier Valley he'd pulled over for a broken taillight and ended up handcuffing because the guy had attitude. The woman in Capitol Hill he'd detained during a protest because she'd mouthed off when he told her to move along. The teenager in South Seattle he'd pushed against a wall for looking suspicious near a convenience store that had been robbed the week before. Each memory surfaced like a drowning victim, gasping and undeniable. I thought I was good at my job, Derek said, and his voice had become hollow, emptied of everything that had once filled it with certainty. I thought I was one of the good ones. I thought... He stopped, unable to complete the thought, because completing it would require confronting how deeply he'd deluded himself. That's what makes the system so insidious, Mark Hendricks said, speaking up for the first time since the video had started playing. His voice carried the measured authority of someone who'd spent 3 decades studying law and justice and the gap between them. It allows people like you to think you're doing good work while perpetuating harm. It rewards your behavior with promotions and accommodations. It dismisses complaints as aberrations rather than patterns. It creates an environment where you can spend 22 years hurting people and still believe you're a hero. Naomi moved to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline where the sun had now fully set, leaving the city illuminated by artificial light that made it look simultaneously beautiful and cold. I've been thinking about this moment since Sarah called me 3 months ago, she said, her back to the room, her reflection visible in the glass. I've been preparing for it, planning for it, knowing that eventually someone like you would walk into my space and see a problem instead of a person. And I've been trying to decide what justice looks like, what accountability means, what we do with people who've caused harm, but who genuinely didn't understand they were causing it. She turned back to face Derek, and in the low light her expression was difficult to read, layered with complexity and contradiction. You assaulted me today. You violated my dignity, my safety, my sense of peace in a space I built with my own hands and my own vision. And I want you to face consequences for that. Real consequences. Public consequences. Consequences that send a message to every other officer who thinks a badge gives them the right to treat people as less than human. She took a breath, her hands gripping the windowsill behind her. But I also want you to understand why those consequences matter. Because punishment without comprehension is just cruelty. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't prevent the next Derek Holloway from doing exactly what you did. Captain Morrison stepped forward, and Derek saw that his superior officer had been changed by the last 20 minutes as well. The professional mask had cracked, revealing someone grappling with uncomfortable questions about what he'd missed, what he'd allowed, what sins of omission he'd committed by not looking more carefully at the patterns in his department. "Ms. Kendrick," Morrison said carefully, "I want you to know that the department will conduct a full investigation into Officer Halloway's conduct, not just today, but throughout his career. What you've shown us here," he gestured toward the computer screen, "it raises questions that should have been asked years ago, questions that I should have asked." "With respect, Captain," Naomi replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Departmental investigations are part of how we got here. They're internal, insulated, designed to protect institutional reputation rather than pursue institutional truth. I appreciate your commitment, but I won't be relying on it. I'll be filing a civil suit. I'll be pressing criminal charges. I'll be using every platform available to me to ensure this moment is documented, examined, and used as a catalyst for change." She looked directly at Derek then, and he felt the full weight of her gaze. The accumulated pressure of everything she represented. Not just herself, but Sarah Mitchell, and Marcus Thompson, and Jennifer Washington, and all the others whose names he'd heard today, whose faces he couldn't remember, whose complaints he'd dismissed as he dismissed that photograph in the hallway. "You asked me earlier what I wanted from you," Naomi said. "Here's my answer. I want you to spend the rest of your life understanding what you did today and what you've been doing for 22 years. I want you to feel the weight of every person you've harmed. I want you to grapple with the reality that your good intentions and your self-image as a protector were lies you told yourself to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. And I want you to use that understanding to stop other people from making the same mistakes." Derek felt tears threatening, a pressure behind his eyes he hadn't experienced since he was a child. "How?" The word came out broken. "How do I do that? How do I fix something this big?" "You start," Sarah Mitchell's voice said from the phone speaker, "by accepting that you can't fix it. You can't undo the harm. You can't restore what you took from people. All you can do is refuse to look away anymore. All you can do is see the evidence even when it contradicts what you want to believe. All you can do is remember that 7 seconds of genuine attention, of intellectual honesty, of basic human respect could have prevented all of this." Naomi picked up her phone, finally ending the call with Sarah. And then she did something unexpected. She walked over to Derek, stopping just a few feet away, close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the toll this day had taken on her, despite her composed exterior. Close enough that he could see she was human, not a symbol or a lawsuit or a catalyst, but a person who'd been hurt and who was choosing how to respond to that hurt with more grace than he deserved. "In a few minutes," she said quietly, "you're going to leave this building. You're going to go home to your family. You're going to have to explain what happened today. And then you're going to have to wake up tomorrow in a world where everyone knows what you did, where your name is attached to this moment forever, where your grandchildren will be able to Google you and find footage of you assaulting a black woman CEO." She paused, letting him feel the full dimensions of his new reality. "That's your consequence. That's your accountability, living with what you've done in a world that finally, briefly decided to pay attention." Derek nodded, unable to speak, unable to do anything but accept this verdict. "But here's what I want you to know," Naomi continued, and now her voice softened even further, becoming almost tender. "This doesn't have to be the end of your story. It's the end of one story. The story where you were Officer Derek Halloway, respected veteran, good guy with a badge. But it could be the beginning of another story. The story of someone who confronted the worst parts of himself and chose to use that confrontation as an opportunity for growth instead of denial. I don't know if you're capable of that kind of transformation. Most people aren't. But if you are, if you can truly see what you've been blind to, then maybe, someday, years from now, this moment will mean something beyond just punishment." She stepped back then, creating distance. re-establishing the boundaries he'd violated. Captain Morrison moved forward, his hand firm on Derek's shoulder, guiding him toward the door. The two younger officers fell in behind them, a silent escort bearing witness to the long walk from the office to the elevator to the lobby to the street. As Derek moved toward the exit, he turned back one last time to look at Naomi. She stood framed by the window, the lights of Seattle creating a halo effect around her silhouette. She looked simultaneously powerful and vulnerable, victorious and exhausted, like someone who'd won a battle but knew the war was far from over. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, Derek finally saw her. Not as a threat or a problem or an obstacle, not as a symbol or a category or a set of assumptions, but as Naomi Kendrick, CEO, innovator, human being, person who'd been hurt by his blindness and who'd chosen to transform that hurt into something larger than revenge. He saw her, finally, completely. 7 seconds too late. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime that sounded to Derek like a bell tolling. Captain Morrison stood beside him in the descending car, neither man speaking, the silence between them thick with thoughts that had no adequate words. Through the glass walls of the elevator, Derek could see the floors dropping away, each level a countdown to a ground floor he'd crossed less than an hour ago as a different person. The man who'd entered this building no longer existed. In his place stood someone hollowed out, stripped of the armor he'd worn for 22 years, left with nothing but the raw truth of who he'd been and what he'd done. The lobby appeared through the glass, and Derek saw Carlos still at the security desk. The young man looked up as the elevator descended, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with recognition. He'd tried to warn Derek. He'd tried to prevent this collision. But Derek had dismissed him with the casual arrogance of someone who believed his badge granted him omniscience. Now, as their eyes met through the glass, Derek saw his own failure reflected in Carlos's expression. Not judgment, exactly. Something sadder. The look of someone who'd watched a tragedy unfold with the inevitability of a train approaching a car stalled on the tracks. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. Derek stepped out into the marble lobby that suddenly felt less like a monument to innovation and more like a mausoleum, a place where something had died. His career, yes, but more than that. His certainty, his ability to believe in his own righteousness, the comfortable fiction that he'd spent 2 decades being one of the good ones. Morrison guided him toward the exit with a hand that was neither rough nor gentle, simply functional. The automatic doors slid open, and the cool Seattle evening air hit Derek's face like a baptism, washing over him with the smell of rain and exhaust and the salt tang from the sound. The city continued its evening rhythm, oblivious to the fact that Derek Holloway's world had just imploded 23 floors above the street. People walked past on the sidewalk, talking on phones, carrying briefcases and coffee cups, heading toward dinner or home or wherever their lives were taking them. None of them knew what had just happened. None of them cared. The world was so much larger than any individual catastrophe. And yet, for the people living through those catastrophes, the world contracted to the size of a single moment, a single choice, a single irreversible mistake. The police cruiser was parked at the curb, its lights off, trying to be discreet in a situation where discretion had already been lost. Morrison opened the back door, and for a terrible moment Derek thought he was going to be placed inside like a criminal, transported in the cage where he'd put so many others. But Morrison shook his head, closing the door again. "You can drive yourself home," he said quietly. "You're not under arrest, not yet anyway. That'll come later after the DA reviews everything." He paused, his hand still on the cruiser door. "Derek, I've known you for 15 years. I thought I knew what kind of cop you were. I defended you when complaints came in. I vouched for you. And now I have to ask myself if I enabled this, if I allowed my loyalty to blind me to patterns I should have seen." Derek wanted to absolve his captain, to say it wasn't Morrison's fault, that no one could have known. But the words stuck in his throat because they weren't true. Sarah Mitchell had known, Naomi Kendrick had known, all the people who'd filed complaints had known. The truth had been available all along to anyone willing to see it. Morrison's failure wasn't one of information but of attention, of the same selective blindness Derek had practiced, just applied differently. "Go home," Morrison said finally. "Talk to your wife, call a lawyer, get ready for what comes next." He turned away, then stopped, looking back over his shoulder. "Derek, that footage of you looking at her picture in the hallway, that's going to be played in courtrooms and training sessions for years. You're going to become the example of what not to do, how not to think, who not to be. That's your legacy now. 22 years of service, and this is what you'll be remembered for." The words landed like stones, each one settling into the foundation of Derek's new reality. Morrison walked away, leaving Derek standing alone on the sidewalk outside Meridian Technologies, a building he would never enter again. He looked up at the glass facade, at the lights in windows where people were probably working late, making decisions that would shape the future, building things that mattered. And on the 23rd floor, barely visible from street level, he could see the glow from Naomi's corner office, a single point of illumination in the darkening sky. Derek pulled out his phone, staring at the screen for a long moment before dialing. His wife answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the assumption that everything was normal, that her husband would be home for dinner in an hour, that their lives would continue along the trajectory they'd always followed. "Hey, honey, I was just about to start cooking. Are you on your way?" "Linda," Derek said, and he heard his voice crack on her name. "Something happened. Something bad. I need to come home and explain, but I need you to know." He stopped, unable to find language adequate for what he needed to say. "How did you tell your wife of 28 years that the man she'd married, the man she'd built a life with, had revealed himself to be someone neither of them fully knew? I hurt someone today. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. And everything's gonna change now." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Then Linda's voice came back, quieter now, stripped of its earlier brightness. "Come home, Derek. Just come home." He ended the call and stood for another moment on the sidewalk, watching the city move around him. A bus passed, its brakes hissing. A couple walked by holding hands, laughing at some shared joke. A homeless man sat against the building across the street, his cardboard sign illuminated by streetlight. Derek wondered if he'd ever stopped to read those signs, if he'd ever seen the person holding them as anything other than a problem to be managed or ignored. The question opened into a chasm of other questions, all of them variations on the same terrible theme. How many people had he failed to see over the course of his life? How many moments like this afternoon had he sleepwalked through, his assumptions so deeply embedded that they operated below the level of conscious thought? 3 blocks away, in an apartment in Capitol Hill, Sarah Mitchell sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and a laptop open to a news site that had already picked up the story. Former police officer fired after assaulting tech CEO. The headline read, and below it, a photograph of Derek that looked like it had been pulled from the department website. Sarah stared at the image for a long moment, feeling something complex and contradictory move through her chest. Not satisfaction, exactly. The victory felt too bitter, too hard-won, purchased at the cost of too much pain for too many people. But there was relief too, the relief of being believed, of having her 6 years of documentation matter, of watching the system, just this once, just this time, actually hold someone accountable. She picked up her phone and sent a text message to Naomi. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" The response came quickly. "I'm okay, tired, but okay. Thank you for everything you did, for all the years you spent making sure this moment could happen." Sarah typed back, "I wish it hadn't been necessary. I wish the system worked the way it's supposed to." "Me too," Naomi replied. But until it does, I'm grateful there are people like you willing to do the hard work of documentation and truth-telling. Back in her office, Naomi had dismissed everyone and now sat alone in the gathering darkness. She hadn't turned on the lights, preferring the blue twilight that filtered through the windows, painting everything in shades of melancholy and possibility. Her cheek no longer hurt, though she could still feel the ghost of Derek's hand, the violation of having her body treated as an object to be controlled rather than respected. She knew that sensation would linger, would ambush her at unexpected moments, would reshape her relationship with safety and trust in ways she couldn't yet fully predict. But there was something else too. A strange sense of purpose that emerged from the pain. She'd built this company to prove something, to herself, to investors, to a world that had told her in 1,000 subtle ways that someone who looked like her couldn't succeed in tech. And she'd succeeded spectacularly beyond her wildest projections. But today had reminded her that success, no matter how visible, didn't make her immune to the same prejudices that had followed her since childhood. Wealth couldn't protect her. Power couldn't shield her. At the end of the day, to someone like Derek Holloway, she was still just a black woman in the wrong place. The thought could have been crushing. Instead, it clarified something. If her success couldn't protect her, then she had a responsibility to use that success to protect others, to transform this moment of personal violation into a broader push for systemic change. She picked up her phone and began typing an email to her board of directors, outlining a proposal for a new initiative. Funding for organizations that documented police misconduct, scholarships for people like Sarah Mitchell who chose to leave law enforcement and work for accountability from the outside, partnerships with civil rights groups to push for meaningful reform. The email grew longer as she wrote, her fingers moving faster across the screen, the ideas flowing with the clarity that sometimes emerges from crisis. She was turning her pain into strategy, her trauma into purpose. It wouldn't undo what Derek had done. Nothing could undo that. But it could ensure that his action, his moment of violence and disrespect, would have consequences that extended far beyond his individual punishment. She would make sure this moment mattered. Across the city, Derek pulled into his driveway and sat in his car for 10 minutes before finding the courage to go inside. Through the kitchen window, he could see Linda moving around, her silhouette backlit by the warm glow of overhead lights. Their home, their life. Everything familiar and ordinary about to be transformed by the words he would have to say, the truth he would have to tell. He thought about his grandchildren, about the proud way they'd always said, "My grandpa's a police officer," about how that pride would curdle into confusion and shame when they learned what he'd done. He thought about the photograph in the hallway, about those 7 seconds that had contained every choice that mattered, every opportunity to see what was really there instead of what he expected. 7 seconds when the truth was available to him, laid out in clear professional text and imagery, and he'd chosen to look away. Not consciously, not maliciously, but with the automatic ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime training himself not to see evidence that contradicted his assumptions. That was the part he couldn't quite wrap his mind around. He'd thought of himself as observant, as someone trained to notice details and assess situations accurately. But his observation had been filtered through such powerful lenses of expectation and bias that it had become a kind of selective blindness. He'd seen only what confirmed what he already believed. And when confronted with contradictory evidence, his brain had simply discarded it as irrelevant, protecting his worldview from the threat of new information. How did you come back from that? How did you rebuild a sense of self after discovering that your perception of reality had been fundamentally flawed for decades? Derek didn't have answers. All he had was the long, difficult work of trying to see clearly for the first time in his life, even though clarity now came too late to prevent the harm he'd caused. He got out of the car and walked to his front door, each step feeling like crossing a threshold from one life into another. The key turned in the lock. The door opened. Linda stood in the hallway, her face already marked by the tears she'd cried while waiting for him to arrive. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of whatever chaos was about to descend on their carefully constructed existence. "I saw her picture," Derek said, the words emerging without preamble. "Before I went into her office, I saw a photograph of her with her name and title, and I looked away. I dismissed it. I let my assumptions override the evidence right in front of me, and then I—" His voice broke completely. "I put my hands on her, Linda. I slapped her. I assaulted her in her own office because she questioned me, because she had the audacity to ask me to verify what I'd been told before barging in and treating her like a criminal." Linda's hand came up to cover her mouth, her eyes widening with a horror that Derek knew he would carry with him forever. This was what it looked like when someone who loved you realized they didn't fully know you. This was the moment when trust began its long process of dissolution. "Why?" she whispered. "How could you—" "I don't know," Derek said honestly. "Or maybe I do know, and that's worse. Maybe I've been doing variations of this for my entire career, and today was just the first time I did it to someone with the power to hold me accountable. Maybe I'm exactly the kind of cop people have been protesting against, and I was too blind to see it." They stood in the hallway of their home, the space between them suddenly vast despite the short physical distance. Outside, the neighborhood continued its evening routine. A dog barked. A car door slammed. Someone's television played through an open window. The ordinary sounds of ordinary lives, a symphony of normalcy that Derek and Linda would never quite be part of again. In the days and weeks that followed, the story spread like ripples across water, touching lives far beyond the immediate participants. The footage was shared millions of times across social media. News outlets ran in-depth profiles of Naomi Kendrick, celebrating her success while exploring the broader implications of what had happened. Podcasts dissected the incident from legal, sociological, and psychological angles. Derek became a cautionary tale, his face appearing in police training videos and diversity workshops, forever frozen in that moment of looking at Naomi's photograph before choosing to dismiss what it told him. The criminal charges came, as everyone knew they would. Assault in the 3rd degree. The civil suit followed, with Naomi donating every penny of the settlement to organizations working on police reform and accountability. The mayor gave a press conference announcing new protocols for welfare checks and training requirements for all officers around implicit bias and proper procedure. Derek's department underwent a comprehensive review that uncovered other officers with similar patterns, leading to a wave of reforms that, while imperfect, represented genuine attempts at systemic change. And through it all, Derek faced the consequences Naomi had promised him. The public scrutiny, the loss of reputation, the way strangers recognized him on the street and looked at him with contempt or pity or anger. His grandchildren stopped talking about him at school. His wife started attending therapy to process the revelation that her husband had harbored biases and behaviors she'd never fully seen. Some days Derek wanted to disappear, to move somewhere no one knew his name or his story. Other days he forced himself to stay visible, to accept the discomfort as a fraction of the pain he'd caused others. But he also did something else. He started showing up at community meetings about police reform. At first, people didn't want him there. Why should they give platform to someone who represented exactly the problem they were trying to solve? But Derek kept coming, kept sitting in the back, kept listening without defending himself. And eventually, when asked to speak, he told his story with unflinching honesty, not as an excuse, not to rehabilitate his image, but as testimony to how easy it was to become what he'd been. How subtle and insidious bias could operate, how systems could protect and perpetuate harm while everyone involved believed they were doing good work. His words didn't fix anything. They couldn't restore what he'd taken. But they served as evidence that change, while difficult and painful and incomplete, was possible. That seeing clearly, even belatedly, mattered. Naomi continued building her company, continued pushing for the kind of innovation that could reshape industries. But she also became an advocate, using her platform to speak about the intersection of race, power, and accountability. She testified before congressional committees. She funded research into bias in law enforcement. She created scholarships for young women of color pursuing careers in technology, ensuring that the next generation would have easier paths than she'd had. And sometimes, late at night in her office, she would look at the spot where Derek Holloway had stood before striking her, and she would think about those 7 seconds in the hallway. 7 seconds that contained everything: the opportunity to see truth, the choice to dismiss it, the pattern that choice represented, repeated across millions of interactions in a society still grappling with the legacy of assumptions and hierarchies built over centuries. 7 seconds. Such a small amount of time. But time enough to change everything if only we choose to truly see what's there instead of what we expect. Time enough to question our assumptions. Time enough to consider that evidence contradicting our beliefs might be telling us something important. Time enough to recognize the humanity of people we've been trained to view as problems or threats, or less than. The question isn't whether we'll be confronted with those 7 seconds. We will be, again and again, throughout our lives. The question is what we'll do with them. Whether we'll look away, protecting our comfortable certainties, or whether we'll have the courage to see clearly, even when clarity demands we acknowledge uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the systems we're part of. Derek Holloway learned this lesson 7 seconds too late. But maybe, in the sharing of his story, in the documentation of that moment when bias blinded him to truth displayed in plain sight, others might learn it 7 seconds sooner, might pause, might question, might see. That possibility, slim and fragile but real, was the only redemption available in a story that had no clean ending, only the messy, difficult, ongoing work of trying to do better in a world that so desperately needs us to. The Seattle skyline glitters tonight, as it does every night, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in its shadow. But if you know where to look, on the 23rd floor of a glass building downtown, there's an office where something shifted, where consequence found someone who'd always avoided it, where power met accountability, where 7 seconds in a hallway contained all the questions we should be asking ourselves every single day. Who are we choosing not to see? What evidence are we dismissing because it contradicts what we want to believe? And what would change if we finally, genuinely looked?